With many such parables, Jesus spoke the word to them as they were able to hear it. Jesus knew that some of the people listening to him wouldn't quite be able to understand what he was talking about. So he used stories. Let's take just a few moments to take a look at what kind of stories he used. Sometimes when we think about stories, we think of things like fables. There's a very old one, probably well over 2,000 years old, that's one of Aesop's fables. It's a story of the crow and the water pitcher. The crow is thirsty. He finds this water pitcher that has a little bit of water in it, but the opening is too small for the crow to get its head down there. So he tries to figure out what to do. He tries to knock it over, and he can't knock it over, so he can't get to the water. So he starts picking up pebbles and dropping them into the water pitcher. And of course, the water level rises, and he's finally able to get a drink. Now, fables are based on the actions of animals, and they always have kind of a moral, a simple truth. One person has suggested that the moral for this one would be necessity is the mother of invention. Hey, so that's one kind of story, but Jesus doesn't use fables. He uses something very different in order to communicate with the people around him. He uses the parables. Parables are something that you use when you know that there is something that people need to hear, but you also know that they may not want to hear it. They may find it very difficult to understand. They may find it difficult to even want to hear it in any sense. But a parable is kind of a sneaky way to get them to hear it, I guess you would say. It doesn't just tell the truth, it's much more complex. Eugene Peterson, who compiled the Message Bible, describes parables in this way. He says that a parable is like a narrative time bomb. You hear the parable, tick. You wonder about them, tick. You think maybe you understand it, tick. And then as you walk away, tick, or over the course of the next few days, or even weeks or months, then all of a sudden, the meaning strikes home to you, kind of like boom. And it overwhelms you with the implications of what was being told you. But let's look at these two parables that we hear from Jesus today. About the sower who goes out and sows some seed. He plants a seed, he goes home, he goes to sleep. He doesn't worry about what's going to happen because he knows that it will grow and that there's nothing that he can or she can do to make it grow. We all know that. We've planted gardens, we've planted grass seeds. We don't control how it grows, do we? Or if it produces a crop, not really. So, part of what this parable may be getting at is the idea that we have a complete inability to control the kingdom of God. And that's certainly true. But maybe another part of this parable, maybe a deeper truth, is that we cannot really decide who gets to enter into the kingdom of God. God makes that decision. Now, we as people tend to like to draw boundary lines, don't we? We like to say who's in, who's out. But God's kingdom doesn't work that way. God doesn't say, oh, okay, people, you decide among yourselves. This is God's decision. God is the one who judges. And we simply have no control over what God does there. The second parable gets at something a little bit different. And in some ways, it may be even harder. On the surface, it appears to be the story of small things that grow into large things. In that way, it almost sounds like a fable, doesn't it? But if you think about it a bit more, maybe it's something about how God's kingdom overtakes and penetrates our lives. Mustard isn't something that you'd plant in your lawn to have some pretty yellow flowers. You could do that, but pretty soon you'd have mustard all over your whole yard. Kind of reminds me of Creeping Charlie. And we know how difficult that is to get rid of, don't we? The kingdom of God is a new reality that invades our lives. It overtakes us in all the things that we think are important and opens our eyes to what God thinks is important. The kingdom is dangerous because, again, we cannot control it. The kingdom of God is God's grace and love in action. It surprises us, it's dangerous to it, it disrupts our lives. Just when we think we have everything figured out, God's kingdom comes knocking on our door and says, "Oh, guess what? I've got some different plans for you." And all of our dreams can get thrown out the window. This week is the anniversary of the flood that hit this part of the state 10 years ago. At that time, no one thought it was possible that such a flood could happen. It was one of those 1,000-year floods, or maybe a 10,000-year flood. It just wasn't supposed to be possible. But it did. It happened not only in Cedar Rapids, but also all the small towns up and down it, as well as the Iowa River. It overwhelmed us. 10 square miles of this community was underwater. Many people lost not only their homes, but some of them lost their jobs because of it. It took out people's homes, it took out businesses. If you had a lockbox in any of the banks downtown, you know they were underwater. Insurance policies, deeds, all kinds of legal papers were destroyed. People had to start from scratch even to prove who they were, or what they owned. I suspect that a lot of people at that time, including some of you, wondered if it would be possible to be able to put back your life after what happened with that flood. And they probably also wondered whether Cedar Rapids would be able to really come back from that flood. In one way, it's possible to look at what happened in that flood as kind of a parable. Because I think what happened after is as important as what happened at the flood. If anyone had told any of you who had friends or relatives, or you yourselves had homes or businesses in that downtown area, and the Czech Village area, and New Bow, and just all up and down the river, if they had come to you the day after the flood crashed and said, everything will be okay, you wouldn't have believed them, would you? It was too much, too hard. And yet, Look what has changed, what's been accomplished in these 10 years since then. The picture on your left there is at the time of the crust. The picture on the right is what it looks like today. If you want to see some better illustrations of that, go down to the Czech village, go down to Nubo, go anywhere up and down the river. Look at downtown. Changes have been made. Changes that people probably never even imagined could happen. Were all the changes ones people liked? No. Were they all that they might have hoped for? I doubt it. Is it a perfect solution today? No. But some good things have come out of it. Would we ever want to go through that flood again? Oh, no, I don't think so. All the loss, the pain, the confusion, the wondering, no one wants to do that. No one. And yet, that flood and its aftermath reminds us that there are things in this world we cannot control, just as we cannot control God's kingdom. During the welcome today, I mentioned that we're doing this series of sermons on finding rest. So you're probably wondering, what in the world does this sermon have to do with that whole rest concept? It doesn't sound very restful, does it? And I have to admit, when I first looked at this text and I thought about this theme, I thought, hey, I don't see the connection here. But as I thought about it more, there is a connection. And it's related to our everyday lives as we are living them now. If you go back 50, 60 years ago, I know for myself, as well as for many other people at that time, living in Iowa, I had about 4 relationship circles. These are groups of people that I would relate to on roughly a day-to-day or week-to-week basis. I had my immediate family, and it was just the immediate family. We didn't have any relatives living close at that time. There's a school I went to, there's a church I attended, and there's Boy Scouts. And many of the people in those groups knew each other. There was interconnection there. So maybe we're talking 40, 50 people or so. Some people might have had a few more, some a few less. But there's probably somewhere in the ballpark for a good part of the population. Look at today. How many different activities do you or your children or grandchildren and groups do you belong to? Baseball, basketball, soccer, tennis, golf. Then you get things like email and Twitter and Facebook and Snapchat and all that social media. Some of the experts who study these things say it's very possible now for people to have 40 to 50 disconnected relationship circles. That can amount to 1,000 to 2,000 people. People who don't know each other, people that you may never meet face to face in your lives. And yet you try to balance and keep connected with all of those people, all those relationships in some way. We are so busy with all of these things. We don't have much time to think about God or God's parables, do we? We get up in the morning, we do all these things. At night, we're tired, we're ready to go to bed, sleep, and the next day is the same thing over again. it's important for us to take some time to rest, to take a break from that busyness, to take a break so that we can be open to the presence of God and His grace and love in our lives. If we're running around all the time doing all these things, do we ever stop to think about God? I don't think God caused that flood of 2008, but I think what God did was He saw the results of it as an opportunity for Him to be busy in our lives so that we could stop and think about that we needed Him. When all the things that we had depended upon in our lives, our possessions, our money, our identities, been washed away, we had God and only God left. You have to take some time away from the busyness to be able to realize that. To be able to realize that God's grace does come to us, that His love is part of our lives, and He calls us to explore new things and new opportunities with Him. Things we probably haven't thought of before, but new adventures that He can lead us in. In God's grace and love, let us take time to rest. Amen.